I want you to imagine a patient. Let's call him the patient. It is 1979. This patient walks into a hospital and he is just sick, fever, weak pulse, zero energy.
Right.
And the doctors, and these are the best doctors in the world, mind you, flown in from Washington, D.C., from the World Bank and the IMF, they run their tests. They nod solemnly and they say, we know exactly what this is.
Yeah.
You have a severe debt crisis and your economic metabolism is completely clogged up.
Which, I mean, is a classic diagnosis for the late 70s. The global economy was just in the tank. Oil shocks, massive inflation, everyone was feeling sick.
Right, so the doctors prescribe the standard, the absolute gold standard treatment. They give the patient a massive infusion of cash to stabilize the vitals and a really strict regimen of diet and exercise. They say, cut the spending, open the markets, devalue the currency, take this medicine, and you will be running marathons in no time.
The patient agrees.
He agrees. He takes the cash. He promises to take the pills.
And normally, in a movie, this is where the montage starts.
Yeah.
The upbeat music plays, the patient sweats it out, and by the end of the song, he's totally healthy.
Exactly. You absolutely expect the montage, but here is the twist. We flash forward 20 years. It is 1999. The patient is still in the hospital bed.
Yeah.
He's taken the medicine not once, but 15 times. He has received billions of dollars in blood transfusions, but he isn't better. In fact, he's dying. His muscles have atrophy. He is poorer than when he walked in, and the doctors are just standing around scratching their heads asking, why didn't the medicine work?
It's a terrifying image, but it is the exact statistical reality of Sub-Saharan Africa between 1979 and 1999. It is a medical mystery on a continental scale.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we aren't just looking at history. We are really looking at a crime scene. We are diving into African Economies and the Politics of Permanent Crisis, 1979 to 1999 by Nicolas van de Walle.
And this book is trying to solve that exact mystery. Why did 2 decades of incredibly expensive cures result in 2 decades of absolute stagnation?
And just to set the stakes here for you listening, when we say stagnation, we aren't talking about a flat line on a corporate revenue graph.
No.
We are talking about a human tragedy. We are talking about a region of the world where for 20 years, the average person woke up poorer than they were the day before.
Van de Walle calls it the permanent crisis. And what makes this deep dive so fascinating, and honestly a little infuriating, is that he argues the failure wasn't an accident.
Right.
It wasn't just bad luck or bad geography.
His argument is much more uncomfortable. He argues that the economic collapse was actually
Convenient.
convenient. That's a heavy word.
Convenient for the people in charge. He suggests that there was a very specific political logic, a machinery of survival that chewed up all that foreign aid and just spit out poverty.
Wow.
And the most shocking part of the whole thing is that the international community, the people actually writing the checks, might have inadvertently helped build that machine.
That is a massive claim, basically saying that the help was part of the harm.
Exactly. It is a story about a concept called neopatrimonialism.
Which is a mouthful.
It really is. But by the end of this hour, that word is going to explain why billions of dollars seem to literally vanish into thin air.
Okay, before we get to the theory, we need to ground this. Because billions of dollars is hard to visualize, economic stagnation is abstract. I want to zoom in on one specific place. The book opens with a case study that really blew my mind. Let's talk about Senegal.
Senegal is the perfect patient zero for this story. Because if you looked at Senegal in 1979, you would have bet on them.
Why? What made them special?
Well, compared to its neighbors, it was remarkably stable. It had a relatively open political culture. It wasn't a brutal military dictatorship the way some others were at the time.
Right.
And crucially, it was the absolute darling of the international community. The West loved Senegal. France loved Senegal. They really wanted this country to succeed.
So they weren't starved for cash. They had friends in high places.
Far from it. But in 1979, Senegal hits a rough patch. The price of peanuts, which was their main export, just crashes.
Oh, wow.
Palm oil prices go up. They have a massive budget hole. They need help. So the World Bank steps in with a structural adjustment loan.
Okay, pause right there. Structural adjustment loan. We hear this term a lot in history books, usually followed by footage of people protesting in the streets. What does that contract actually look like?
Think of it as a mortgage, but for a sovereign nation. The bank says, here is $50 million cash. You can use this to pay your debts and keep the lights on. But in exchange, you have to fix your house.
And fixing the house means what, practically?
It means austerity and liberalization.
Yeah.
You have to promise to fire unnecessary government workers who are just draining the budget. You have to sell off those state-owned factories that are losing money every single year.
Right.
You have to stop artificially subsidizing the price of rice. Basically, stop spending money you don't have and let the market work.
It sounds like tough love. Like, here's the cash to save you today. Now get your act together for tomorrow.
Right. So Senegal signs the paper in 1979. They get the money. Now let's fast forward through the 1980s. Do you know how many of these fix-it loans they received?
I mean, I'm guessing more than one, or we wouldn't be talking about it. Maybe 3 or 4.
They received 15.
15.
15 separate stabilization and adjustment loans from the World Bank and the IMF between 1980 and the mid-90s.
Wait, in a 10 or 15-year period?
That is roughly one every single year.
Okay, that's not a fix. That's a subscription service.
Exactly. And that is not even counting the bilateral aid. The direct cash from France or the U.S. Senegal was receiving something like $350 million a year in assistance.
Which, for a small economy, is a staggering amount of money.
It is huge. And on top of that, France even forgave a huge chunk of their debt. So you have cash coming in, debt being wiped out, and 15 separate solemn promises to reform the economy.
So if you're listening right now and you're doing the math, 15 reforms plus hundreds of millions of dollars equals a booming economy in the 90s.
You would certainly think so. But let's look at the scoreboard in 1995. After all that help, Senegal's debt wasn't gone. It had exploded to 79% of their GDP.
Wait, how do you get more in debt after 15 bailouts? That seems physically impossible.
We'll get to the how. But the human cost is what really hurts. Look at life expectancy. In 1970, before the crisis, it was 40.6 years.
Okay.
By the late 90s, after all this development and aid, it had crawled up to 52.3 years.
It's an increase, but 52, that's still a quarter century behind the developed world.
And structurally, the economy hadn't changed at all. They were still relying on peanuts. The industry hadn't grown. The private sector was tiny. Van de Waal points out that more than half the population was still living on less than $1 a day.
So the patient took the medicine 15 times and got sicker. This is the Senegal paradox. And this is where I want to push back a bit on the standard narrative. Because usually when we hear about Africa in the 80s, the story is, oh, the World Bank was too mean. They forced these poor countries to cut their budgets too fast, and that austerity caused the poverty.
Right. That is the anti-globalization argument.
Yeah.
The idea that the medicine was actually poison, that the structural adjustment programs, the SAPs, were designed to extract wealth, not build it.
Right. But Van de Waal is saying something different, isn't he? He isn't defending the bank, but he isn't exactly blaming the medicine's ingredients.
No, he's asking a much simpler logical question. If the medicine was so powerful, whether for good or for evil, why did they have to take it 15 times?
Oh, that's a really good point.
If you actually reform your economy, if you actually fire the workers and sell the factories, you do it once. Maybe twice to get it right. You don't do it 15 times in a decade.
Right. You'd be out of factories to sell.
Exactly. The fact that they kept signing new loans suggests that the reforms never actually happened.
They were cashing the checks, but not doing the work.
Or they were doing just enough work to get the check and then stopping. This is what he calls the partial reform syndrome. And to understand why a government would act this way, why they would deliberately sabotage their own economic recovery, we really have to zoom out. Because Senegal wasn't alone. This was happening everywhere in the region.
Yeah, the book makes a big deal about the comparative performance. Because sometimes we think, oh, the 80s were bad for everyone in the developing world. But in 1960, a country like Ghana had the exact same GDP per capita as South Korea. They were starting from the same line.
Exactly. And by the 90s, South Korea is an industrial giant, a tiger economy, and Ghana is still struggling to keep the lights on.
So let's look at the numbers because the contrast is stark.
In the 1980s, while Africa is stagnating, East Asia is growing at over 7% a year.
Yeah.
In the early 90s, East Asia hits 10%.
Wow.
Sub-Saharan Africa, it's limping along at 1.7 to 2%.
Which, to be fair, is technically growth. It's positive. So why do we call it a crisis?
Well, is it growth? Think about the population factor. Africa has the fastest growing population in the world, around 3% a year. So if your economy grows by 2%, but the number of people sharing that pie grows by 3%?
Everyone gets a smaller slice. Per capita income goes down.
Exactly. You are sprinting just to stay in last place. And the global market noticed this. There is a stat in the book that is just brutal regarding marginalization. Africa's share of global GDP dropped from 2.5% in 1980 to 1.1% in 1996.
They were literally vanishing from the map.
Economically, yes. The world was moving on without them. Trade routes were bypassing the continent. Investment was going elsewhere. And this brings us to one of my favorite concepts in the book. It's a term that economists used to whisper about in the faculty lounge: the Africa dummy.
Okay, I have to stop you there. That sounds incredibly offensive. Please tell me that means something else in statistics.
I promise. It's technical, not an insult. But it is very revealing about how confused the experts were. See, when economists try to predict growth, they use complex regression models. It's an equation. You plug in variables like how much inflation do you have, how educated is your workforce, how open is your trade.
It's an input-output machine. You plug in the data, it predicts the growth rate.
Right. And for most of the world, Latin America, Asia, the machine worked. If you had high inflation, growth went down. If you invested in schools, growth went up. But when they plugged in the data for African countries in the 80s, the machine broke.
The math didn't add up.
It didn't. The countries were growing slower than the variables said they should. Even after you accounted for the wars, the droughts, and the bad policies, there was still a missing variable, a mysterious negative force that was shaving points off their growth.
And they couldn't identify it.
No.
Oh.
So they just added a dummy variable to the equation to make the math work. They basically added a minus sign and labeled it Africa.
That's essentially a confession of ignorance. Like, we don't know why this is happening, so we'll just give it a name.
Precisely. It was the economists admitting that their standard toolkit couldn't explain the reality on the ground. Van de Waal's book is an attempt to open up that Africa dummy and see what's inside. He says that the mystery variable isn't magic, and it isn't bad luck. It's politics.
But before Van de Waal came along, there was a huge fight about this, right? The structural adjustment debate. It felt like a holy war between the World Bank and the credit.
Oh, it was vicious. On one side, you had the IFIs, the International Financial Institutions. Their view was the problem is internal. African governments are messing up.
What were they messing up specifically?
The price signals. The World Bank argued that African governments were obsessed with control. They set exchange rates artificially high to make imports cheap for the elites.
Okay.
They protected local industries that produced nothing of value. They ran massive deficits. So the IFI view was get the prices right and growth will follow.
And on the other side?
The structuralists, the critics, they said, no, the problem is external. Africa relies on commodities, coffee, cocoa, copper. The prices for these things bounce up and down like a yo-yo. How can you plan an economy when your income fluctuates by 50% every single year?
Plus, they argued that African markets were rigid. You can't just release market forces if there are no roads to carry the goods, right?
Exactly. They argued that adjustment was just inflicting pain without gain. But here is where Van de Waal steps in and says, you are both missing the point.
How so?
He argues that while they were debating the design of the policy, should we devalue by 10% or 20%, they completely ignored the fact that the policies were never actually implemented.
So the whole debate was useless.
The debate was theoretical. It was like two doctors arguing over the dosage of a pill that the patient has already flushed down the toilet.
So if the policies weren't implemented, why not? This seems to be the crux of the book. If I'm a leader and my country is broke, why wouldn't I fix it?
For a long time, the standard answer in political science was weakness, the urban bias theory. This was popularized by Robert Bates and others. The idea was that African governments were terrified of their own city dwellers.
The mob.
The mob, the trade unions, the civil servants, the students. The theory went like this. If the president cuts the subsidy on bread to balance the budget, the city will riot. If he fires the lazy civil servants, they will strike. And if the city riots, the army steps in and the president is overthrown.
So the paralysis was out of fear. I can't fix the economy because if I do, I'll be killed.
It makes sense intuitively. We've all seen footage of protests. It feels true. You hear anecdotes about Nair in Tanzania fearing food riots or the Niamiri regime collapsing in Sudan. But Van de Waal drops a bomb on this theory. He says, look at the data. Look at Latin America.
Why Latin America?
Because Latin America had real mobs. They had massive militant trade unions. They had urban organizations that could shut down a country for weeks. In Argentina or Brazil, the unions were powerhouses. And yet in the 80s and 90s, Latin American governments pushed through brutal reforms. They slashed budgets. They fired people.
And they survived.
They survived. Now compare that to Africa. Van de Waal argues that African interest groups were actually incredibly weak. They were small, they were fractured, and half the time they were in bed with the government anyway.
So the African leaders faced weaker opposition, but did less reform.
Bingo. That destroys the fear argument. Van de Walle says these leaders weren't trembling in their palaces. They had what he calls high state autonomy.
Autonomy usually sounds like a good thing, like I'm independent.
In this context, it means the leaders are insulated from the public. They can ignore the outcry of their citizens much more than we assume. They can inflict austerity. They can let infrastructure crumble. And they stay in power. They aren't beholden to the voters or the unions.
Okay, so this deepens the mystery. If I am a dictator and I have high autonomy and I'm not afraid of the unions, why wouldn't I fix the autonomy? Surely I want to be rich. Surely I want my country to be powerful. Why would I choose to let everything fall apart?
And that is the million-dollar question. To answer it, we have to look at the operating system of the state itself. We have to understand neopatrimonialism.
There's that word again. Let's break it down.
It's a hybrid term. Neo implies something new or modern. Patrimonialism is an old concept going back to Max Weber. It describes a ruler who treats the state as his personal property. There is no distinction between the national treasury and the king's wallet.
So it's a mix of the two.
It is a facade. On the outside, you have the trappings of a modern state. You have a Ministry of Finance, a central bank, a parliament, written laws. It looks like a bureaucracy. You walk in, there are desks, computers, stamps.
But if you open the door and walk inside the back room...
The reality is purely patrimonial. It runs on personal relationships, patronage, and clientelism. The Minister of Finance isn't there because he's a financial wizard. He's there because he's the cousin of a powerful ally the president needs to keep happy.
So the logic of survival in this system isn't deliver good roads and schools so people vote for me?
No. The logic is distribute private rewards to key elites so they don't overthrow me. You survive by handing out jobs, contracts, import licenses, and access to cash.
It's a loot-sharing system.
In a way, yes. But here is why this specifically kills economic reform. Economic reform, the kind the World Bank wants, is all about transparency, efficiency, and cutting waste.
And waste in this context is the patronage.
Exactly. To an economist, a bloated civil service full of people who don't do any work is inefficiency. To a neo-patrimonial leader, that is his political support base. If you fire those 5,000 ghost workers, you aren't just saving money, you are breaking the contract with your clients. You are destroying your own political safety net.
So reform isn't just difficult, it is a direct attack on the ruler's survival strategy.
It is a fundamental conflict of interest. Privatization is another great example. The World Bank says sell this state-owned factory because it's losing money. The leader thinks, but that factory is where I employ my general's 3 sons and my uncle. If I sell it to a private company, they will fire everyone and I lose my leverage.
This system also seems to favor the now over the later.
Consumption over investment. Always. In a clientelist system, you have to pay off your clients today. You can't say, hey guys, tighten your belt for 5 years and we will build a great power plant. By the time the power plant is built, you might be deposed because you stopped the flow of cash. So resources are consumed immediately to buy loyalty, rather than invested for long-term growth.
This makes so much sense of the permanent crisis. If you fix the economy, you break the politics. But if you keep the politics, you break the economy.
That is the track.
Okay, but I still have a question. If the leaders have absolutely no intention of reforming because it would be political suicide, why did they sign all those loan agreements? Remember Senegal, 15 loans? Why sign the paper if you aren't going to do the work?
Because they needed the cash. Remember, the economy's crashing. The patronage system needs fuel. You need money to pay off those clients. When the economy tanked in the late 70s, the internal money dried up. The copper mines stopped paying out. There were no taxes to steal.
So the machine ran out of gas?
Exactly. And when the machine runs out of gas, the clients get angry. The general says, where is my cut? The tribal leader says, where's my subsidy? The president needed a new source of rents. Enter the World Bank and the IMF.
Enter the donors. This leads to what Miles Kaller called the orthodox paradox. The donors were asking the state to implement reforms that would dismantle the state's own power base, but they were paying them to do it.
So how did the leaders navigate this? It seems like an impossible situation. Do the reform and lose power, or don't do the reform and go broke?
They chose option C, the illusion of reform, or what Van de Walle calls partial reform syndrome.
How does that work? Is it just straight up lying?
It's a brilliant, if cynical strategy. It goes like this. You sign the agreement. You promise everything. Yes, we will privatize. Yes, we will cut the budget. Yes, we will fire the ghost workers. That signature gets you the first tranche of money.
The check clears. The check clears. Then you implement the bare minimum. Maybe you devalue the currency a little bit because That's easy to do with a pen stroke. It doesn't require administrative capacity. But the hard stuff, the institutional changes, you delay.
Ah.
You form a committee to study the feasibility of privatization. You pass a law, but you just don't enforce it. You dilute the process.
And eventually the donors catch on, right? They aren't stupid.
Eventually. And they suspend the loan. They say, hey, you didn't do what you promised. But by then, you've already spent the first chunk of money. You've got another year of loyalty. And then, and this is the stop-go cycle, a year later, the crisis gets bad again. You go back to the donors, you promise to be good this time, you sign a new agreement, and the cash starts flowing again.
It's like a toxic relationship. They break up, they get back together, they break up.
And the data supports this perfectly. In Senegal, privatization was stalled for years. Then it would lurch forward a tiny bit. Maybe they sell one hotel, then it stalls again. And remember that stat about civil service employment. Between 1990 and 1995, despite promising to cut the civil service, employment in the Senegalese government actually increased.
While they were under a structural adjustment program to cut it.
While they were cashing checks meant to help them cut it.
That is bold. But it suggests the state wasn't just passive. We often think of these states as weak or collapsing. But this suggests they were actually very skilled at manipulating the international system.
They were incredibly skilled. They were masters of sovereignty. They used their weakness as a weapon, basically saying, if you don't help us, we will collapse and there will be chaos.
Or the elites learned how to manipulate reform to actually make money, didn't they? It wasn't just about stalling.
Oh, absolutely. The elites adapted. Take privatization. If you were forced to sell a state company, who do you sell it to?
I assume to the highest bidder.
In a real market, yes. In a neopatrimonial market, you sell it to your cousin or your business partner or a shell company you own at a rock-bottom price. You strip the assets. You use the crisis to centralize power further.
So the permanent crisis wasn't a failure for everyone.
No. For the elites, the permanent crisis became a stable equilibrium. They survived. They kept their jobs, their Mercedes, their trips to Paris. The economy didn't grow. The poor got poorer. Infrastructure collapsed. But the regime stayed intact.
This brings us to the role of the enablers. We have to talk about foreign aid, because without that external cash, this whole house of cards falls down, doesn't it?
It does. And this is where the book challenges a very popular narrative. You hear it all the time from celebrities and activists. Africa needs a Marshall Plan.
Referencing the massive U.S. aid package that rebuilt Europe after World War II, the idea is that a big surge of cash kicks off growth.
Right. But Van de Waal points out a statistic that just stops you in your tracks. By 1996, the average African country was receiving aid equivalent to 12.3% of its GDP.
Is that a lot?
To put it in perspective, the Marshall Plan was about 2.5% of the recipient country's GDP.
Wow. So Africa received, in relative terms, nearly 5 times the Marshall Plan.
Yes, for 20 years.
Okay, so lack of money wasn't the issue. If money fixed things, Africa should be Wakanda by now.
The issue was what the money did. In Europe, the Marshall Plan kickstarted investment in a system that was already functional. In Africa, aid substituted for private investment.
What do you mean by substituted?
Think about it. If you were a private investor, say a shoe manufacturer, and you look at a country like Zaire or Senegal in the 80s, you see corruption, you see volatile currency, you see a government that seizes assets. Do you build a factory there?
No way. Too risky.
Exactly. Private capital stays away. So who fills the gap? The donors. The aid money came in and simply replaced the money the economy should have been generating itself. It became the only game in town.
It sounds like it acted as a life support system for the neo-patrimonial state.
Exactly. It sustained the unsustainable. Without aid, these regimes would have gone bankrupt. They would have hit a hard wall. They would have been forced to either genuinely reform because they had no other choice, or they would have collapsed and been replaced. Aid provided a soft cushion that allowed them to avoid that reckoning.
But why did the donors keep giving it? This is the part I really don't get. If I lend you $20 and you waste it, I don't lend you another 20. I definitely don't lend you $20 15 times. Why did the World Bank and the Western powers keep writing checks for 20 years of failure?
The donor dilemma. It's a mix of bureaucracy and geopolitics. First, there is defensive lending.
Defensive lending.
Imagine you are the World Bank. You have lent a country $1 billion. They can't pay it back. If they default, it looks terrible on your balance sheet. It looks like you made a bad loan.
So you look incompetent.
Right. So what do? You lend them new money just so they can pay the interest on the old money. You keep the loan performing on paper by feeding it more cash.
That is a Ponzi scheme.
It's very creative accounting. Then there is the institutional pressure. If you work at the World Bank or USAID, your job is to move money. You get promoted for signing loan agreements, for starting projects. You don't get promoted for saying, no, this country's too corrupt, let's keep the money in the vault.
So the incentives for the bankers were perfectly aligned with the incentives of the dictators. Everyone wanted the money to flow.
Exactly. And don't forget the Cold War. For a lot of this period, the West was terrified that if they cut off aid, these countries would turn to the Soviet Union. So Mobutu in Zaire could steal billions, and the U.S. kept sending checks because, well, he's our guy.
And there was a weird collusion in lying about success, wasn't there?
Yes. The donors needed to claim success to justify their own existence to their taxpayers. So they would point to a signed piece of paper and say, look, reform is happening. The critics needed to claim the reforms were savage to push their ideological agenda against capitalism. So both sides exaggerated how much reform was actually happening.
Well, in reality, very little was changing on the ground. The pill was never swallowed.
Exactly. Partial implementation served everyone's political needs except the needs of the actual economy.
So we move into the 1990s, the Berlin Wall falls, the Cold War ends, and a wave of democratization sweeps across Africa.
The wind of change. It was a huge moment. Multi-party elections, free press, dictators being forced to step down or hold votes. It was a very exciting time.
And surely this must have fixed the problem. If you have voters, you have accountability. If the president destroys the economy, you vote him out. That's how it works here.
That is the theory. And everyone hoped that democracy would break the neopatrimonial cycle. But Van de Waal's analysis of the data in the 1990s leads to a pretty depressing conclusion. It didn't fix the economy.
Really? Democracy didn't help?
Not immediately. When he compares economic performance before and after these transition elections, he finds little change in the logic of decision-making.
Why not? Are you saying voters don't care about the economy?
No, they care. But the new democratic regimes were operating within the exact same neopatrimonial logic. You might have a new president, but he still faces the same problem. A weak state and a desperate need to buy loyalty.
So instead of buying off just the generals, now he has to buy off voters too.
Exactly. Clientelism creates a trap. If you want to win an election in a system where the state is the only source of wealth, you don't promise better policies. You promise stuff. You promise jobs for your ethnic group, roads for your region, cash for your supporters.
So democracy might have actually made the patronage worse.
In the short term, yes. It made it more expensive. You had to build larger coalitions. The loot had to be spread thinner. But the mechanism of looting remained exactly the same.
It's baked into the walls.
It is. Van de Waal notes that many of the new Democrats were actually just old elites from the previous regime who had rebranded themselves. They knew how to play the game.
So is there no hope in the book? Is it just everything is broken forever?
No, there is a glimmer of hope. He suggests that while the immediate economic results weren't there, the rise of civil society, a free press, associations, people asking questions, might, in the very long run, force better governance.
Transparency makes it harder to hide the loot.
Exactly. But he is very clear that democracy is not an instant economic fix. You can't just sprinkle ballot boxes on a dysfunctional economy and expect it to grow.
Let's wrap this up and summarize the argument because it is a powerful one. It is a perfect storm scenario.
It is. You have three ingredients mixing together to create the permanent crisis. One is neopatrimonial politics. Leaders who need to buy loyalty to survive, which makes them allergic to efficiency. Two is low state capacity. Even if they wanted to change, the bureaucracy is too weak and corrupt to do it. Three is high aid flows, a constant stream of money that insulates leaders from the consequences of their bad decisions.
And the result is a zombie economy. Not dead, but not really alive.
And the real danger, which Van de Waal warns about, is path dependency.
That sounds like a fancy way of saying history matters.
It does. It means that 20 years of crisis doesn't just mean you press pause on growth. It means you degraded the foundation. Schools fell apart. Roads washed away. A generation of civil servants grew up learning that corruption is the only way to get paid.
So recovering in 2000 is infinitely harder than it would have been in 1980.
Exactly. You aren't starting from zero, you are starting from -10.
It is a sobering deep dive today. It forces us to rethink everything we hear about development and aid.
It really forces us to look at the political incentives. We often think of economics as just math. Move this lever, pull that pulley. But Van de Waal shows us that economics is downstream of politics. If the political survival of the leader depends on not fixing the economy will not be fixed.
And it leaves us with a very provocative final thought for you, the listener. We often think of foreign aid as an act of charity, a lifeline thrown to a drowning swimmer.
But Van de Waal's analysis suggests a darker possibility. If that lifeline is what allows a corrupt, inefficient system to survive for 20 years without changing, at what point does the lifeline become the rope that ties the country to stagnation?
Is the international community, with all its good intentions, actually complicit in the crisis? That is something to chew on.
Yeah, it certainly makes you look at a World Bank press release differently.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you on the next one.